song to sing, but I appreciate you all being here. And you also do realize that there's a repeat of Honey Boo Boo Child on right now, don't you? Probably. I appreciate the introduction. I must admit, I always find it really strange to hear myself introduced as a TV anchor. I never really set out to be a TV anchor, and I'm always rather suspicious of anybody I meet in the business who tells me that's what they set out to be as a kid. It's like a kid who tells me they want to be a politician. I think you should be a real person before you become a fake one. So I never quite set out to do this. And I don't often make speeches. I really enjoy talking to people, but I actually don't like to hear myself talk, which is probably not a very good thing, a quality to have in my profession. So I'm hoping tonight could be something of a conversation. I know there's a bunch of questions that folks have written down and stuff, so I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for Q&A, because I often find that's some of the more interesting stuff. But I thought I'd just talk a little bit tonight about how I got into this profession and what it's like really covering some of the major stories of our time. And as I said, I'll try to leave plenty of time for Q&A. As I said, I never really set out to be a TV anchor. I graduated college in 1989. I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I graduated with a liberal arts degree, which means I had no actual skill. And when I graduated, I asked my mom, a liberal arts major is like, yes, I have no skill either. When I graduated college, I asked my mom for some advice, and this was a rare occurrence in my life because my mom, as you may know, is Gloria Vanderbilt, and she's a remarkably talented lady, really fascinating lady, but practical she is not. So she really was not the kind of parent you would go to for advice. In fact, the only other time I can remember asking her for advice was when I got my first job as a waiter one summer in high school. And I asked her, I was going for the job interview, and I said, what should I do for the job interview? And she thought about it. She said, wear vertical stripes because they're slimming. And oddly enough, I am wearing vertical stripes tonight, probably for that very same reason. So anyway, I was in desperation. I asked my mom when I graduated college for advice and what she thought I should do. And she said, follow your bliss. You think it's funny? I know, I did too. I actually wanted something a little more specific, like plastics or something with a sense of direction. But follow your bliss was actually pretty good advice. It's not original advice, I should point out. She actually was watching TV, and there was a reporter, Bill Moyers, interviewing a guy named Joseph Campbell, who was a professor from Sarah Lawrence, and he coined this term, follow your bliss. So basically my mom was giving me advice she had cribbed from TV. And I'm glad she was not watching Jerry Springer or Maury, because the advice then would have been something about a DNA test. The problem, of course, as you know, is trying to figure out what your bliss is, and at the time I really had no idea. I had been a political science major in college, and in fact I had spent 4 years studying communism and the history of communism. So when the Berlin Wall fell in the late 80s, I was completely screwed, because I had spent 4 years studying the system that was no longer in place. And, I mean, I was happy for them, so don't get me wrong, but I must admit, I watched with a little sense of like, oh my God, what happens now? What do I do now? So I never really studied journalism, but I'd always been interested in news and television, particularly the experiences of war correspondents during Vietnam. And I'd actually left high school early, and I'd driven in a truck across sub-Saharan Africa. And Africa had really opened my eyes and quickened my pulse in a way that had never happened before. I fell in love with the variety of different countries in Africa. And it was the first time I'd had to talk my way through a roadblock. It was the first time I'd had somebody point a gun at me. And it was an incredibly exciting experience. So when I graduated, I decided that whatever I wanted to do, I wanted travel to be a part of it. The problem, of course, I decided I'd try to be a war correspondent, because I read a lot about war correspondents in the Vietnam War. It's a tough business to break into, so I came up with this plan, and my plan was basically I would just start going to wars. I know it sounds pretty basic, but I tried to get an entry-level job at ABC News, and I could not get hired, which shows you the value of a Yale education these days. And so I couldn't get hired, so I decided if no one would give me a chance, I'd have to take a chance. If no one would give me an opportunity, I'd have to create my own opportunity. So I had a friend make a fake press pass for me, and I borrowed a home video camera, and I just started going to wars. And my mom was thrilled, as you can imagine. And I figured if I went to places that were really dangerous, I wouldn't have much competition. So the first story I did is actually I moved to Southeast Asia and I snuck into Burma and I hooked up with some students fighting the Burmese government. And then from there I basically ended up in Somalia in the early days of the famine back in 1992. So I was about 23 or 24 years old. And Somalia was really eye-opening for me. It was the first time I'd seen starvation up close. It was the first time I'd seen a child die. And in Somalia, I knew that I'd found my calling. I knew that I couldn't stop the death, I couldn't stop the starvation or the war, I couldn't save people's lives, but I could try to bear witness to their struggles. I could give voice and testimony to their lives. And I was in a town called Baidoa in Somalia. It's a small town outside Mogadishu, and there were about 100 people dying there every single day from malnutrition and starvation. And mostly the very young and the very old, because those are always the first to die. And I thought, just tonight, I thought I'd show you a little bit of the first story I ever really did, which was in Somalia in 1992. This was before the U.S. got involved, before the whole Black Hawk Down incident. And so I've got a little video that's just a minute or two of the first story I ever shot on a little home video camera. And when you see me in the story, it's actually, I hired these, in Somalia you had to have protection, you had to have security, you had to hire these Somali kids with AK-47s to be your protection, or else they would shoot you. It was sort of they would approach you and explain that you needed protection from them. So anyway, I hired this group of like 15 and 16-year-old kids with AK-47s. One of them had a grenade launcher. And I was actually more scared of them than anybody else, because we would be at like a burial ground and there'd be empty pits, and I had to try to think, why wouldn't they just shoot me? Because I've got more money in my backpack than I'm going to end up giving them. So I would tell them all these stories about all my journalist friends who were coming, and they would need security too, and did they have a business card? Maybe I could pass it along. Anyway, they ended up not shooting me, which I very much appreciate to this day. And so I shot this little story, and also I just want to warn you, I mean, it's quite a serious story, but I also want to warn you on the less serious side, I had brown hair there, so do not run screaming from this auditorium. Not only did I have brown hair, I had sort of a flock of seagulls whoosh, yes, yeah, whoosh. You're dating yourself, so anyway, so this is Baidoa, Somalia, 1992, at the height of the famine, the first story I ever shot, just a little bit of it. Let's take a look.
At outdoor kitchens, young and old, like human skeletons, sit in rows waiting for food. It's cooked in empty oil drums on charcoal fires. The smell of cooking food fills the air and taunts the hungry.
In the background, you can hear AK-47 shots firing right now. They're a feeding center run by the organization CARE. There are about 30 or 40 of these feeding centers run by different organizations all throughout the city of Baidoa. You'd almost expect there to be pandemonium here. They're shooting in the distance, people waiting for food, but there's really not. It's in a way, starvation seems to suck the life out of you. You just sit and wait. There's nothing more you can do.
Some die waiting. They sit down and never get up. Their bodies are pushed aside by the living. Few tears are shed. The dead are brought to makeshift morgues and then buried in unmarked pits outside of town.
They've just brought another body in now. That makes it about 10 or 11 bodies that are in so far. It's only 8 o'clock in the morning. Muhammad, the man who cares for these bodies, says that by midday, when the truck comes to take the bodies to the burial ground, he expects there to be about 60 or 70 bodies. It's hard to describe what it's like being here. When you walk in and you see the bodies, it's unreal. You don't realize they're bodies at first. They're covered in shrouds, and they're so thin. I mean, my hand is about 6 inches from finger to finger, and that's how wide most of these bodies are. It's incredible.
On the sides of roads, animals and humans lie rotting where they fell. Maggots feast while humans starve in Baidoa. I tried to distance myself, tried to find ways to escape the sight, the smell of the dead and the dying. At night, I stayed behind the guarded walls of the Red Cross. But even at night, the sounds of guns firing told me where I was.
Death and suffering are everywhere here in Baidoa. I was walking down this road and just came upon a family whose son just died as I was standing there. And they're now watching his body. You want to do something, you want to cry out, you want to grab someone and get them to help, but there's no help to be had, and there's no one around. For a lot of these people, it's too late. You know, the relief supplies are coming, but they've been suffering for months, and they're going to die. And there's nothing you can do.
I sat and watched the boy's father use what little water he had to clean his son's body. They had come to Baidoa because they had heard there was food here. The father had already watched his 2 other boys die. This was his last. He was 5 years old. He was just one boy. His was just one death. It happens 1,000 times a day in places like this all over Somalia. It happens every day. Reporting from Africa, I'm Anderson Cooper from Channel 1.
So that was Somalia in 1992, and I may have gone to Yale, but I really feel like I was educated in Somalia, in that town Baidoa, and in Sarajevo, and in South Africa, and Rwanda, and all the places that I traveled to the first 3 years as a war correspondent. Places where the boundaries aren't clear, where the dark parts of the human heart are open for all to see. I realize now, looking back, that part of me, what motivated me to go to these places was that I wanted to be places where pain was palpable. I had a brother who had committed suicide my senior year of college, and I wanted to be places where the language of loss was spoken. I wanted to surround myself with emotion and go places where the pain outside matched the pain that I was feeling inside. And I wanted to learn from people how to survive. And in those first 3 years working as a war correspondent, I saw more bodies than I can remember. I saw more horror and hate than I can count. But I also found myself constantly surprised by what I saw and what I discovered in the far reaches of our planet, the truths that are revealed in the dwindling light of day when everything else is stripped away and everything else is raw. You know, in war you expect to find darkness, but you also find light. And you expect to see horror, but you really discover humanity as well. In 1994, I ended up in Rwanda in the genocide, and I don't know how much you know about the genocide in Rwanda, but in the midst of about 100 days, about 800,000 to 1 million people were killed. And it was very personal murder. It wasn't bombs and bullets and killing from afar. It was neighbors killing neighbors and men killing women and children with knives and not even with guns, just knives and clubs. And it was as if this terrible madness had descended in Rwanda. And it was there that I realized that we're all capable of anything. We can all commit great acts of barbarism and brutality, and we can also commit great acts of compassion and kindness. And it's a choice, and the choice is up to each of us. And Rwanda, for me, was sort of a final straw. After that, I decided not just to cover war, that I need to cover a bigger variety of things in order to be able to continue to do this, because it really does take a toll on you. And I think it's very easy, but you know, I still find myself drawn to these conflict zones and drawn to telling stories of people who are suffering and people in need. And I think it's very easy in this day and age to ignore the sadness of others. It's very tempting to ignore that. It's very tempting to ignore the reality of other people's lives, but I think it's important that we not turn away. I think it's important that we look directly into the things that scare us most. If any of you have served in a combat zone, you know, I mean, being in a war zone, it's unlike anything else. Your whole body feels locked and loaded. There's nothing like the feeling. You're running toward what everyone else is running from. The air, it seems to like hum. The molecules, it feels charged, like the neutrons and protons are colliding about. You're literally on the edge of life, and you can feel it. And regular life seems very dull by comparison. You come back home from being in a war zone, and you know, you're happy for a short amount of time, and then very quickly you're kind of thinking about the next war zone you're going to go to. It's as if you come home and you almost can't speak the same language as everyone else. I still travel to conflict zones as much as I can, and it's much more dangerous now than it was when I first started back in '92. Kidnapping is much more of a threat for reporters as it is for everybody overseas. I'm certainly much more recognizable back then, especially with my freakishly odd white hair. I don't really blend in well, particularly in like Africa or stuff, but I try to as much as possible. I try, but I'm told I don't, repeatedly. But most big news organizations nowadays, I don't know if you know this, most big news organizations nowadays hire security consultants who travel with us. And that was something that never happened back in '92 or '93 when I first started. When I first started, I was traveling all by myself, and it was years, in fact, for the first 2 years, I didn't even have a bulletproof vest. And the company I was working for didn't provide me with one until the last year when I was renegotiating my contract, basically.
Wow.
And it was funny. The vest they gave me, I was going to Sarajevo,